Story: The Woman in the Cornfield. In the summer of 1998, my family moved to a quiet farmhouse in rural Nebraska. It was surrounded by miles of cornfields, stretching endlessly in every direction. My parents were excited for a fresh start, but even as a kid, I felt something was off about that place. There was something wrong with the fields. At night, the wind would blow through the corn stalks, making them rustle like whispers. Sometimes, if I listened closely, I thought I could hear words. And then there was the woman. The first time I saw her. One evening just before sunset, I was playing in the yard when I saw something in the fields. A figure, tall and thin, standing between the corn stalks. She wore a long black dress, her hair white as bone, hanging over her face. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching. I ran inside, breathless. My dad looked out the window but saw nothing. "Just a shadow," he said. "The wind plays tricks out there." But I knew what I saw. And she wasn't a trick. The tapping on my window. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her, standing in the fields. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my window. Slowly, I turned my head and saw her. She was right outside, her face inches from the glass. Her mouth was moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. Then her hand rose and scratched the glass. I screamed. My dad ran in, turned on the lights, but by the time he looked, she was gone. She knows my name. The next morning, I refused to go outside. I stayed in my room, but I could feel her. That night, the wind picked up again. The whispering was louder now, almost like chanting. And then, through the rustling corn, I heard it, a voice calling my name. "Come outside! Come outside!" I pulled the blankets over my head, shaking. Then, the front door creaked open, and footsteps began moving through the house. The final night, the next morning, I told my parents everything. My dad was frustrated, saying I was imagining things. But my mom, she was pale. That night, she told me to sleep in their room. Around midnight, I woke up because someone was crying. It was coming from the hallway. I peeked out and saw a shadow moving toward my room. I wanted to scream, but then the shadow stopped. And in the dim light, I saw her face. The same white hair, the same hollow eyes. But this time she smiled and whispered, "Almost time." We left the next day. My mom woke up screaming, saying she had a dream where a woman in black was standing over the bed. That was enough. We packed and left the house that morning. I never went back, but sometimes when I drive through the countryside, I see the cornfields, tall and endless. And if I listen closely, I swear I can still hear it. The whispering, calling my name. Story: The Man in the Vents. In 2013, my cousin David moved into a small apartment in Chicago. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom unit in an older building, but the rent was cheap, and he was excited to live alone for the first time. The only thing that bothered him was the air vent. It was too big, much larger than a normal vent should be. It sat high on the wall near the ceiling, with a rusted metal grate covering it. When he asked the landlord about it, the old man just shrugged. "Building's old," he said. "They don't make 'em like that anymore." David thought nothing of it, until the scratching started. Something in the walls. A week after moving in, David began hearing noises at night. At first, it was just light tapping, like mice scurrying in the walls. But soon it turned into scratching, long, deliberate scratches, as if something was dragging its nails along the metal. One night, while lying in bed, he heard something new, breathing. It was faint but steady, coming from inside the vent. David turned on his phone's flashlight and aimed it at the grate. The sound stopped immediately. That was the first night he slept with the lights on. The grate is open. The next morning, David stood on a chair and inspected the vent. The screws holding the grate in place were loose, like someone had been unscrewing them from the inside. He tightened them as best he could and tried to put it out of his mind. But that night, around 3 a.m., he woke up freezing. The apartment felt unnaturally cold, and for some reason the hair on his arm stood on end. He turned over in bed, and his stomach dropped. The vent was open. The grate was hanging by a single screw. And below it, on the floor, a single footprint, the face in the dark. David didn't sleep. He sat in bed, clutching his phone, heart hammering in his chest. He told himself he was imagining things, that maybe the grate had just fallen loose on its own. Then he looked up and saw two eyes staring at him from the vent, wide, unblinking, watching. David froze. For what felt like forever, neither of them moved. Then the mouth opened, and a voice, his own voice, whispered, "Let me out." The man in the crawl space David ran. He grabbed his keys and bolted from the apartment, spending the night at a friend's place. The next morning he went straight to the landlord and demanded an inspection. When maintenance opened up the wall behind the vent, they found a hidden crawl space, a narrow, pitch-black tunnel running along the inside of the building. And in the dust-covered floor of that tunnel, they found handprints. Someone had been living there. The police were called, but they never found anyone. No signs of forced entry, no explanation for how he got in. David moved out that same week, but sometimes when he walks past old apartment buildings, he still looks up at the vents. Because he swears something is still watching. Story: The house that called me back. In 2005, my family moved out of our old house in Pennsylvania. It wasn't anything special, just an aging two-story home on a quiet street. But for some reason, I never felt comfortable there. There were odd things, small, unsettling details. The house was always too cold, no matter how high we set the thermostat. Sometimes at night, I'd hear footsteps on the stairs when everyone was asleep, and the basement door, it never stayed shut. But the thing I remember most, the whispers. I would hear them late at night, coming from the walls just at the edge of my hearing. Murmurs I could never fully understand. When we finally moved, I felt relief, like I was escaping something. I didn't expect the house to call me back. The letter 15 years later, in 2020, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, no name, just a short, handwritten note. "You need to come back. The house remembers you." I should have ignored it. I should have thrown it away. But I didn't. The house is different. When I arrived, the house looked the same. Same peeling paint, same overgrown yard. But something felt wrong. The windows were too dark. The air was too still. I knocked on the door, expecting no answer. But after a few seconds, the door swung open. Inside the empty house, the house was abandoned. No furniture, no signs of life, just dust and silence. But as I stepped inside, something caught my eye. At the base of the staircase, there was a trail of footprints in the dust. Bare footprints. They led from the front door to the basement. Something is waiting The basement door was open. It had never stayed shut when we lived here. Now it stood wide open, revealing nothing but darkness. I should have left, but something drew me forward. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. As I stepped down, the air grew colder. Then I saw it. At the bottom of the stairs in the farthest corner, a mirror. It hadn't been there before. The reflection that wasn't mine. The mirror was old and cracked, covered in grime. But as I wiped the surface, my breath caught. Because the reflection wasn't right. It wasn't me. It looked like me. But the eyes were too dark. The expression was too still. Then it moved. I hadn't moved. The reflection took a step toward me. I stumbled back, but in the glass my reflection was smiling. And then it spoke. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was mine, but it didn't come from my mouth. It came from behind me. The house remembers I ran. I don't remember how I got back to my car. I don't remember driving home. But that night as I lay awake in my apartment, I felt it, a presence. The air grew cold, and in the mirror across the room, a shape moved. The house hadn't just called. Story, the thing in the hotel room. In 2019, Daniel was traveling for work when he checked into a cheap roadside motel in Arizona. It wasn't much, just a bed, a bathroom, and an old TV. But it was only for one night. The woman at the front desk handed him his key and gave him a strange look. Try not to look at the mirror too long, she said. Daniel laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. The wrong reflection. The room was musty, the air conditioner rattled, and the only mirror was a tall, old one bolted to the wall opposite the bed. As he set his bag down, he glanced at his reflection. For a second, something seemed off. His reflection's posture wasn't quite right. It was standing too straight, staring a little too directly. He shook the feeling off, showered, and got into bed. But as he reached for the light switch, he saw it. His reflection hadn't moved. Something else in the glass. Daniel sat up fast, heart pounding. He waved his hand. The reflection copied him, but there was a delay. Then slowly, it smiled. Daniel hadn't smiled. That was enough. He grabbed his things and headed for the door, but the door wouldn't open. The lock was stuck. The knob wouldn't turn. Then from behind him, a whisper. Stay. The hand on the glass. Daniel refused to look back. He squeezed his eyes shut, yanked at the door, and finally it burst open. He ran straight to the front desk. The woman didn't look surprised. You saw it, didn't you? She asked. Daniel nodded out of breath. She sighed. That room, it doesn't like being ignored. What is it? Daniel asked. The woman hesitated. Something old. Something that wants out. Daniel left without another word. Later, when he checked his phone, he noticed something strange. A new photo in his camera roll. It was blurry, dark, taken inside the hotel room. And in the center of the frame, a pale hand pressed against the mirror. Story. The thing in my grandmother's house. When I was a kid, I spent every summer at my grandmother's house in rural Maine. It was an old Victorian home, filled with creaky wooden floors, antique furniture, and a constant smell of lavender and dust. I loved my grandmother, but I hated that house because there was something else living there, something in the upstairs bedroom. The locked room. There was one room on the second floor that was always locked. No one was allowed inside. My grandmother never talked about it, never explained why. If I asked, she would just shake her head and say, "Some doors aren't meant to be opened." That should have been enough for me, but I was a kid, and one night curiosity got the best of me. Something is inside. It was late, past midnight. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. I tiptoed upstairs, heart pounding, and stopped in front of the locked door. For the first time, I noticed something strange. Scratch marks around the keyhole, as if someone had tried to claw their way inside, or maybe out. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the wood. At first, there was nothing. Then, a whisper, low, raspy, and right on the other side of the door. "Let me out." The door opens. I ran back to bed, pulling the covers over my head, heart racing. I barely slept, convinced I had imagined it. The next morning I tried to tell my grandmother, but before I could even finish, she grabbed my wrist, harder than she ever had before. "You didn't open the door, did you?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear. I shook my head. She let out a breath. "Good. Never go near that room again." I wanted to ask why, but the look in her eyes stopped me. The night the door opened itself. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of a creaking door. I sat up, confused, until I realized where it was coming from. The locked room, the door that had been shut for decades, was slowly swinging open. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but something made me stay. The door opened wider, revealing nothing but darkness. The air that poured out was cold, wrong, and then footsteps. Soft, shuffling footsteps moving toward me. But the room was empty. Then I saw it, a shadow on the floor. Long, twisted, but there was nothing there to cast it. Then whispers, "Come closer." I didn't. I slammed the door shut and ran back to my room. The truth about the room. The next morning, my grandmother didn't say anything. She just placed a new lock on the door, a bigger one, and she never let me out of her sight again. Years later, after she passed, my mother finally told me the truth. My great uncle had lived in that room when he was a child, until he disappeared. One night he was there, the next morning gone. No forced entry, no signs of escape, just an open door and the faint smell of lavender. They never found his body, and every new lock they placed on that door, something always tried to open it again.